This is Gemara Menachos, Daf Ayin Zayin. And today's share has been sponsored by a close friend of the Daf that's been learning with us for years as a schos aliyas neshmasa for Miriam Abbas Eliazer HaKohen. Siyata Deshmaya, all the learning. Talmud Torah Berabim should bring an incredible aliyas neshama to Miriam Abbas Eliezer HaKohen, whose yard site is on Yud Aleph Nisan. The incredible Koyach HaTorah, especially Torah as we're leading up to Pesach, should bring the ultimate aliyas neshmasa, elevating her heilige neshama higher and higher in Gan Eden Shel Maila. And we're holding on Ayin Vav Beis as we dive into a new parak, a parak that's going to pivot a little bit. It's going to pivot a little bit. Well, of course, we're still within Menachos world, but it's going to pivot into the Karban Taida. The Karban Taida being, which we've already spoken about, a Karban Taida being 40 loaves of bread, 10 types of each of the 4 loaves of bread. We have only one of the types is going to be chametz, the others are going to be matzah. So if you do the math, if 1 is chametz and 3 are matzah, times 10 is 10 is chametz and 30 is matzah. Says the Mishnah, Ha-taida isabam chamesh sa'in Yerushalayim yois. The taida comes from flour measuring 5 Jerusalem sa'in, shehin, which are shish midbariyos, which are 6 wilderness saws, different types of measurements, different types of measuring the flour. Shtei ephais, which is 2 ephais. Ha-ephai shalish sin, esrim isarain, 20 isarain, asara lechametz, v'asara lematzah. 10 for the chametz and 10 for the matzah. Again, the requisite flour, etc., used for the carbon. And we turn over to Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. It says the Gemara, asara lechametz, asara lechametz, asara what? 10 isarain. Again, that requisite measurement for the chametz, isarain lechala. V'asara lematzah, and 10 for the matzah. Uva matzah sholish minim. But the matzah were 3 types: chalois, rikikin, and revucha. 3 types of matzah. And again, as we started off saying, there are 30 matzahs, so 3 types, 10 of each. Nimsu, it comes out, says the Mishnah, shloisha esrainim ushlesh l'chal minim. 3 and a 30 sarain of flour are used for each type of matzah. V'shalosh chalois li'isarin, and 3 matzah loaves per isarin. So these are all the flour measurements, how much is used for the matzah, the chalois, etc. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol. Continues the Mishnah, Uvamida Yerushalmius. So again, there's basically 2 types of ways of measuring this isarim. There's the way that the Torah measured it, and then Yerushalayim, they didn't use that unit of measurement. This is like, the inch to the centimeter of a chulu, but rather they used the midos Yerushalmios. So says the Mishnah that if you calculate the midos Yerushalmios, shloishim kav was 30 kav. Chamesh esel lechametz, chamesh esel lematzah, chamesh esel lechametz, kavu mechsa lechala, chamesh esel lematzah. And says the Mishnah, ubamatzah shalish minim. But in the matzah there were 3 types, as we keep on referencing: chalis, rikikin, and revucha. Nimsu chamisha kabin chominu min ushtei chalis likaf. So lots of numbers, which are obviously a little complicated, as these are measurements and numbers that, of course, we don't have nowadays. But at the basics, we're seeing that the 40 loaves, the 10 and the 30, and how they were divided into the different quantities of flour, etc. Says the Gemara, as the Mishnah opened, it said, the taida came from flour of 5 Jerusalem sa, which are 6 midbariyos sa, which the Mishnah said, which are 2 ephais, and every ephah is 3 sa. Minan immediately, where do we get this from? Amar Rav Chisda Amar Kra, Ha'efa v'habas toichein echad yihiyeh. The efa and the bas are the same value. Ma'abas shalosh sayin, afisha shalosh sayin. So that's how we know that when the Mishnah calculated the efa to be 3 sayin, it comes from said pasuk of efa v'habas toichen, and this is a pasuk in Yecheskel. Says the Gemara bas kufa minol. How do we know that the bas itself, the last calculation, is 3 sa? Where do we know that from? Says the Gemara, we know it from Midechsev, another pasuk. This is going to be another pasuk in Yecheskel that says the pasuk Lasis is a meiser achaymer abbas, to carry literally or take the meiser of the chaymer abbas, of the liquid chaymer. So what do we see? So we see in the pasuk there continues that how much is it? Toichen yeh lasis meiser chaymer bas vasiris chaymer ifa lechaymer yeh mas kuntoi. So says the Gemara, ifa nami oksev vasiris chaymer, but ha'ifa it says the same thing by the ifa el chaymer. So rather we have to explain that what this measurement kol chaymer lo yodana kama. We don't really know what it is. Hachanami lo yodana kama. So also we don't know what it is. So if we don't know what the chaymer is, says the Gemara, so now you're telling me that an ifa is the same volume as a bas. How do we know that the bas is 3 sa? Says the Gemara, Ela mehacha v'choik hashemen habas hashemen u'meiser habas minakor aser sabatim chaymer ki aser sabatim chaymer. So what do we see in the pasuk? The pasuk calculates the math for us. Another pasuk in Yecheskel, the pasuk tells us that the bas of the oil is like the meiser of a core, and 10 bas is in the chaymer. So what do we see? We see very simply that a bas is 1/10 of a core. As it said, it's a meiser. So now if we know that a core is 30 sa, so we had equals, and what do we see? That a bas, which is 1/10 of 30, must be 3 sa. So says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel. So that's part A of our Mishnah, calculating that the Taida is Chamish Son Yushalmiyos, and as we calculate that down to measurements of Bas, Chaymer, etc. Now says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel. We're a little past the halfway line. The first word line is Shmuel. Ein Moisiven Alamidos Yeser Mishtos. So the Mishnah did a lot of calculations for us, and the Mishnah equated the different measurements within. So says the Gemara, we do not increase the measurements by more than a 6, nor than a coin than a 6. And if you profit, you cannot benefit from more than a 6. And this really brings us back to our Bar Mitzvah days, our days of learning the halachas of oina, of overcharging. As we see over here, that the Gemara is telling us that you can never do a price increase, a quantity increase, a measure increase, than more than a shtos. My time, says the Gemara. If the reason is you're worried about inflation, and if you measure and if you bump up prices, you might take the measurements more than a shtos. It didn't cause inflation. Then even a 6 you should not be allowed. That also causes inflation. Says the Gemara, you know why? Because of the halacha of einav, or overcharging. Because we know that halacha is, if you overcharge by more than a shros, more than a 6, the mekach is batul. So says the Gemara, that's the reason why we can't change anything than more than a 6. But asks the Gemara, we forgot a very basic halacha, says the Gemara. The shtos does not apply if it's something that's measured, if it's something that's counted. If it's weighed. So says the Gemara, these are items. We're talking about weights. So how can you tell me that we're still worried only up to the shtos? So Ella, says the Gemara, you know why? Mishum Tigra. The reason that you cannot change the weights by more than a shtos is because of a merchant. That what? Keche delay limtuye Diana or Ziana, two different girsais over here. So the merchant should not suffer a loss if he doesn't know that the weights change. Again, we're discussing that there's an increase in the weights, in the measurements, how we're calculating one to another. So said the Gemara, you never let him make an increase or a decrease by a shtus. Why? Because if the new guy in the market shows up to town, shows up to the fair, and he doesn't know about that shtus, he's going to make no money. So that's why not. Says the Gemara. So he should not. Are you only worried he shouldn't suffer loss of his principal? He doesn't need a profit. Zavan, v'zavin, tagra, ikri. I understand. Does he buy and sell just to be called a tagra? Avadi, he wants to make a profit. So says the Gemara, you're mitigating and saying, okay, at least he'll cut even. Because at least if it's only by a shtas, it's not going to cause him a loss, says the Gemara. Shkayach. But where's this guy making cash? So Elam Rav Chisda. So why does he go by a 6? Shmuel, Kra, Ashkach, Vidarash, 4 lines on the white lines. Shmuel found a pasuk that teaches us that weights and measurements can only be changed by a 6. Says Shmuel, Va'ashekel Esrim Geira. The shekel is 20 Geira. Esrim Shkolim, Chamisha v'esrim Shkolim. Asara v'chamisha shekel. Hamana yiyeh lochem. 20 shkalim, 25 shkalim, 20 and 5 shkalim, which all together is equaling 60 shkalim, should be a mana to you. Says Shmuel, what do we see from this pasuk? Mana mosan va'arba'in havu. Does a mana consist of 240 dinar, 60 shkalim? From the fact that he says the mana is 100 dinar, which is 25 shkalim. So says Shmuel, from this pasuk, you know what we learn? Says Shmuel, again, this is another pasuk in Yecheskel. We learn 3 things. Shema Mina. On the first white line, din number 1, we learn Shema Mina shel kodesh kafel haya. Mana shel kodesh kafel haya. We learn that the mana of kodesh, the sanctuary mana, was double a regular mana. Din number 1. Ushma Mina. And din number 2, we learn Ma'isivin ala mida. You should add on to the measurements. Bavim ma'isivin yosem mishtos. Ushma Mina number 3. Shetuta milbar. How do you calculate the 6? Externally. Amar Avina Masisna Amideka Tekatani Taida Haisa Ba Chamish Sain Yushalmiya Shehein Shisha Midbar Yoshma Mina. So our Mishnah shows us that it is milbar, that it is externally. So the Gemara Lamais is concluding that where does this 6 measurement come from? No, it is not. No, it is not because of the merchants, but rather Shmuel found a precedent in the Psukim, and that's what he pins this halacha on. We flip over to Ayin Zayin Amid Beis. So Mishnah number 1 taught us quantities, taught us the recipe. Get to know how many ingredients put in. Mishnah number 2 says the Mishnah. Let's go deeper into the Taida. Me'kula mayonait el echad me'asara truma. From each of them, the 4 types of bread, you take 1 out of 10 as truma. Echad shlayit el parus. 1 shows us that you cannot take a broken loaf; it has to be a whole loaf. Mikol karban shiakol karbanoi shavis. Shlayit el mikarban al chaveiroi la koyin, and it has to be given to the koyin as Eric said. Dama shalomim lo yiyat for him. Vashar is nechol koyanim. So the halacha of the meiser that you're going to have to take, or I should say the truma that you have to take from the loaves of bread, 1/10 being given to the kohen. Says the Gemara Tanarabanan v'ikrim mimenu min ha'mechubar. Says the Torah v'ikrim mimenu. You offer from it, which shows us min ha'mechubar. You separate from that which is attached. Echad shall yital paris. 1 teaches you should not take a broken loaf as the truma. Mikol karban, she call her karbana shavais, which shows us that all the karbanas should be equal. Shloyitol min karban al chaveiroi truma l'Hashem ein yodea mikama. Pasuk says, Truma LaHashem, I don't know. Excuse me, how many breads is separated? So we're starting to learn out from the Psukim, their halachas. Problem is, says the Gemara, the Pasuk is not explicit. How much is this Truma? So explains the Gemara, 4 lines on the wide lines, Harini done. So let's reason as follows. Nemer kan Truma, Nemer Truma is Meiser Truma. We know the word Truma, right? So what does the word Truma mean, says the Gemara? Mal halanechel me'asara, avkanechel me'asara. Okay, but wait. Or maybe not. Never kan Truma, never bikurim Truma. Wait, we find the word by bikurim Truma, and therefore what? The first word, malal and ein lo shir, by bikurim, there's no shir. Avkan ein lo shir. So nearly me daina. What are we making the taida more comparable? Should it be more comparable to regular Trumas Meiser or to bikurim? Says the Gemara, nearly me done in Truma, she'in achareho Truma, mi Truma she'in achareho Truma. Don't ask from bikurim chuma. Why? Because bikurim has a din. You have to bring the bikurim to the Beis HaMikdash, and then after it's brought from the Beis HaMikdash, there is another set of truma that has to come from it, right? Because bikurim are the first fruits, but it doesn't exempt the entire crop. Of course, there's still dinim of trumas and meiser given to the Kohen to the Levi, so you're not done. So by us, it's the final stage of this carbon taida. So learn from something. It's the final stage, which is regular chumas meiser. Says the Gemara in the third line, or maybe not. And therefore should be learned that from the bikurim. So says the Gemara, Talmud Loimar, Mimenu Truma LaHashem. From it should be a Truma to Hashem. Uksiv Trumas Meiser Mimenu Truma. So says the Gemara, L'gzira Shava. So we learn out the din by our carbon taida from Truma, from Gzira Shava. Lamanu L'Truma Shiachad Me'asara. Okay, so now we have a makar that how much of the carbon taida, how much of these 40 loaves of every 10 you take off one, we learn out from Trumas Meiser. I don't know how much flour each is made of. Harini done. Nemer kan lechem and nemer lalim b'shtei lechem lechem. Malhalini sarayin lechala. Afghani saran lechala. Oikach lezu nemer kan lechem and nemer lechem apanim lechem. Malhalin shnei Yisrael nice. Afghan shnei Yisraelim. So says the Gemara, I don't know. What is the quantity of flour? What is the quantity of flour for the carbon taida? Do we learn out from the Shtei Alechem or the Lechem Apanim? Nearly me done. Danim mincha abba mechametz im azevach, mincha abba chametz im azevach, which is the Shtei Alechem. Vayuchel Lechem Apanim sheina ba chametz im azevach. That's one way. Oiklach lederech zu. Danim mincha abba me'eretz v'chutz la'aretz min hachadash u'min hayashan. Mincha abba me'eretz v'chutz la'aretz min hachadash min hayashan, which is Lechem Apanim. Vayuchel Shtei Alechem sheina ba yis elam min hachadash u'min haaretz. So Talmud Loimar, so where do we learn it out from? So says the Gemara, we have a pasuk that says, taviu lechem tenufa shtayim. Shein Talmud Loimar, the pasuk did not have to say taviu. Oma Talmud Loimar taviu, excuse me. Shatamevi makam acher, harehu kazeh. Everything should be like this. And what does that learn out? Malan isar in l'chala, afkan isar in l'chala. But maybe you're going to say that just like with the Shtei Alachem, there's two Isara, and so too over here. Tamaleimer no, Tihiyena, Lamano. The Tamaleimer Tihiyena. So that's how we learn out that it's going to be one Isar. Continues the Bryce, Lamano, Asara Lachametz. So now you learned out the requisite quantity of flour for the carbon taida that comes from chametz. But what about asar lematzah minayim? What about the 10 loaves that were matzahs? Tamaleimer al chalos lachem chametz neged chametz abba matzah. It's to be the same proportions. Nimsu asrim isroina islachmei taida asar lachametz. And asara le matzah. Yoch, I would think asara shema matzah ye kula elmi min echad. Maybe it has to all be from one type of bread, like by the chametz. Talmud Loimar imaltei yakrenu vehikriv al zevach. Hatoida chalos matzahs blues, but shem rukiki matzah b'shuchim, but shem is also rukeves maraveches v'gomer. Nimsu. So what does it come out that we see from this pasuk? Shloisha esrainim v'shlish chomin v'vein, 3 1/3 of each and every one. Ushalosh chalois liisari nimsu lachmei taida. So says the Gemara, let's do math. Noita men araba v'nois the kohen v'hashar nechon l'baylim. So of the 40, 4 go to the kohen, and the rest goes to the baylim. Amar Mar. Let's dive in. One last tickle Gemara. Says the Gemara, Amar Mar. Let's go into the end of this brisa. V'hikrev mimenu. Said the brisa, you bring it from it. Well, not the end of the brisa, but min ha'mechuber al me'ata d'chsev es kol chal b'yara mimenu. It says by the pasuk, by a carbon chatos, all the fat that you separate from it. Hasam ha'mechuber yikra. If you tell me that mimenu means it, what's the mechuber by the chatos? Kid Rav Chisda Amar Avimi, Damar Rav Chisda Amar Avimi. 10 lines on the bottom. Shelo yinateach basar kodim shitalei murim. What this means is you cannot remove the basar, can't cut off the basar before you put the emurim on the mizbeach. So at some level it is a mechuber, the basar and the emurim. Amar Amar Namar kan shuma v'namar b'shuma is meiser shuma. Says the Gemara. V'nel mitchumas midyan. Why do we learn out from midyan, which is 1/500th, says the psukim. It was a one-time thing. Why do we learn out from chumas chala, which we know the requisite chala is 43 1/3 eggs, and you have to take off egg zayis, or we could call it 5 pounds. Says the Gemara, Tanav Rishmal, Tanav Davar Shenemar by Mimenu. La fuke chumas chalad lo nemer ba mi menu. Chuma la Hashem doesn't say menu, therefore we don't learn out from it. We'll stop over here. I'll pick it up from Bayi Rava the next year. B'siyata dishmaya.